Thank you for the honor of being here this evening. I am delighted to be a part of this event, the 50th anniversary of the Commission. While anniversaries are a celebration, they offer us an opportunity to pause, reflect and evaluate the past, and to consider lessons learned, and to look ahead. And that's what I'd like to do this evening. Before doing so, I do want to offer my congratulations to the Commission on its hard work and leadership in human rights over the past 5 decades in promoting equality, protecting individuals from discrimination, and encouraging diversity and belonging in this province through education and resolving complaints through conciliation and adjudication. And I look forward to what the next decades will bring. Our history makes one thing clear. Human rights is the responsibility of everyone in the community. Each of us has a responsibility day by day in our homes, in our schools, and in our workplaces to acknowledge the dignity of others, to respect them, and to honor their individual human rights. In this way, nurturing human rights in a community is like cultivating a garden. Ensuring the garden grows to be lush and thrives takes time and it takes work. The efforts of all the participants in the human rights system and society at large. The garden has to be weeded, pruned, and sometimes the plants have to go dormant for a while in the winter in order to flourish in the spring. Sometimes the soil may be amenable to growth, at other times it may be poor and even hostile, requiring more tilling, nutrients, and care. In 1966, the Social Credit Government of Alberta introduced the Alberta Human Rights Act, at that point Canada's third anti-discrimination statute. It prohibited discrimination based on race, religious beliefs, color, ancestry, or place of origin. Under that legislation, some 1,600 complaints were received, including one from Frances Weasel Fat. Hers was only one of 3 complaints that made it to a board of inquiry. The Blood Tribewomen and all First Nations people were required to pay in advance before pumping fuel at a Denny Shell service in Magrath, Alberta, while the gas station's typical white customers were not. In the context of the garden analogy, it could be said that Alberta's soil was not doing so well. Ultimately, the Board of Inquiry found the gas station owner had discriminated against First Nations customers when he required them to pay in advance for gas and other goods and services that he didn't require their customers to do. The board required the decision to be published widely and directed the gas station to desist from further discrimination or face prosecution under the Act. I wondered about Mrs. Weasel Fat's life. Born in 1938, she was in her early 30s when she brought this human rights complaint. Tracing Mrs. Weasel Fat's life from this point forward, we can assume she was motivated by concern for her community, though unfortunately we can't ask her. She died in 2021. In the 50 years that followed her human rights complaint, Mrs. Weasel Fat, a residential school survivor, dedicated herself to building cultural pride, identity, and self-worth within her community and combating discrimination. She was a director at K9 News and a leader of the Canadian Indian News Media Association. She was a treasurer and education representative on the Indian Association of Alberta during the 1980s and was publicly thanked by the association for, quote, contributing so much over a period of many years to protect Indigenous rights, end quote. On the reserve, she actively preserved traditions and customs. But her most important work arguably came in housing advocacy. When the Alberta Human Rights Commission held a 2-day open house with minority groups in Lethbridge in 1989, its first public meeting outside the 2 major centres, Mrs. Weasel Fat, then operations manager of the Treaty 7 Housing Authority, an organization she helped form, shared evidence of discrimination against First Nations people. Through the 1990s and into 2000s, then in her 60s, Mrs. Weasel Fat was in Lethbridge setting up and running a transition home for Indigenous women and children as they moved from reserves to the city. The accommodation was coupled with life skills training in finances, health, and mental health. Mrs. Weasel Fat told a reporter at the time, quote, "There's not enough affordable housing for all, not just Natives. But if an Indian is going to compete for a unit with a non-Indian, you know who's going to get the unit," unquote. Mrs. Weasel Fat not only called out racial discrimination, she created practical solutions to reduce its impact on First Nations people. I highlighted Mrs. Weasel Fat's life because her work was extensive and important, yet little is known of her outside the community. This information was pieced together by the communications officer at the Court of Appeal, Paula Beauchamp, who dug into her history at the University of Lethbridge's archives, reports from the Aboriginal Multimedia Society of Alberta, and confirmed it all with her family. Mrs. Weasel Fat worked in the community to fulfill the aspirations of human rights in a meaningful way. So many people in attendance here today do the same. How many more unsung heroes are challenging discrimination when they find it and advocating for a change that would ultimately improve the lives of Albertans? The law can only do so much. The Commission can be the main caretaker, but all Albertans have a role to cultivate and ensure the dignity of each individual is respected.